Ancient Rome was not merely a city, it was a living organism, a society bound together by intricate customs, political hierarchies, and social obligations that dictated nearly every aspect of daily life. Understanding this social fabric is essential before examining the more disturbing practices that occasionally surfaced within it, such as the unsettling wedding night rituals Rome attempted to erase from memory. At its core, Roman society was structured around family, status, and the relentless pursuit of power, which in turn shaped every relationship, every ceremony, and every expectation imposed upon its citizens. The foundation of Roman society was the familia, or family unit, which extended far beyond the nuclear family familiar to modern eyes. It included children, spouses, slaves, freedmen, and often distant relatives, all under the authority of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. The paterfamilias wielded enormous power, not only over property and financial affairs, but also over life and death within the household. His authority was legally sanctioned, religiously justified, and socially reinforced. The paterfamilia's word was law, and his decisions could profoundly shape the futures of every family member, particularly women and children. This hierarchical structure meant that individuals were rarely treated as autonomous agents. Their roles and actions were defined primarily by their place within the family. Marriage in Rome cannot be understood without grasping this family-centered social order. Unlike modern ideals that emphasize love and personal choice, Roman marriages were primarily strategic alliances. Families arranged unions to secure political influence, accumulate wealth, or strengthen social ties. The bride and groom were often chosen not for mutual affection, but for what the marriage could bring to their respective families. In this sense, marriages were less about individual happiness and more about maintaining or elevating the family's position within society. Women, especially those from elite families, were expected to embody the honor and reputation of their household. Their actions, particularly in the context of marriage, were scrutinized not merely as reflections of their character, but as indicators of the family's overall status. The social hierarchy in Rome was rigidly enforced. The distinction between patricians, aristocratic families, and plebeians, common citizens, remained significant for centuries. Patricians enjoyed privileges in law, religion, and political life, while plebeians often faced limitations in property ownership, civic participation, and social mobility. Slavery further complicated the social structure. Slaves were integral to daily life, performing labor that ranged from menial household chores to highly skilled administrative tasks. Freedmen, or former slaves who had earned their freedom, occupied an ambiguous social position, sometimes accumulating wealth and influence but never entirely shedding the stigma of servitude. This stratification influenced every interaction in Roman society, from public ceremonies to private family gatherings. Social customs and public perception were paramount. Romans placed extraordinary emphasis on dignitas, personal reputation, and auctoritas, social influence. These qualities were not simply individual traits, but were tied to one's family and lineage. A misstep in behavior, a scandal, or a breach of social etiquette could tarnish not only an individual, but an entire household. Public ceremonies, therefore, were more than mere tradition. They were demonstrations of social standing and moral virtue. Weddings, funerals, religious sacrifices, and political gatherings all functioned as platforms for displaying power, obedience, and familial loyalty. A Roman's worth was measured less by personal achievement than by the ability to navigate and uphold these intricate societal expectations. Education and upbringing were critical in perpetuating this social order. Roman children were taught early to respect hierarchy, observe ritual, and fulfill their expected roles. Boys were groomed for public life, preparing to manage estates, participate in politics, or command armies. Girls were educated primarily to manage households, bear children, and maintain the honor of the family. Even literacy and intellectual training were gendered. The scope of a girl's education was often limited to reading, writing, and domestic management, whereas boys could pursue rhetoric, philosophy, and law, tools essential for civic influence. From the earliest years, Romans were indoctrinated into a worldview where personal desire was secondary to social obligation, and failure to adhere to these norms could have severe consequences. Religion was another cornerstone of Roman social life. The Romans viewed the favor of the gods as essential for the well-being of families, communities, and the state. Rituals and ceremonies punctuated every aspect of life, from births and marriages to harvests and military campaigns. The household gods, or lares and penates, presided over family affairs, while state deities ensured Rome's political and military success. Observing religious customs was not optional, it was a civic duty. Public piety reinforced social cohesion, while neglecting ritual could be seen as morally suspect or even dangerously impious. This intertwining of religion and social expectation added an additional layer of pressure, particularly on women, who were often responsible for maintaining domestic religious practices. Within this context, we begin to understand why certain rituals, such as marriage ceremonies, could evolve into practices that modern observers would find disturbing. The combination of patriarchal authority, social stratification, religious obligation, and familial expectation created an environment where personal autonomy was limited and conformity to tradition was enforced by both law and social pressure. Private ceremonies, performed behind closed doors, were sometimes used as tools of control, reinforcing obedience and securing family honor in ways that could be psychologically and physically invasive. Rome's obsession with appearances, honor, and lineage meant that many practices were deliberately hidden from public scrutiny. While public ceremonies celebrated social cohesion and religious devotion, private rituals could reflect darker aspects of control and domination. These rituals, though rarely recorded in detail, hint at the lengths to which Roman society would go to ensure that family structures, social hierarchies, and religious customs remained intact. Women, in particular, were vulnerable in this system, as their bodies and behaviors were often considered extensions of familial prestige rather than autonomous selves. In conclusion, the social fabric of ancient Rome was a complex web of hierarchy, obligation, and ritualized behavior. Family authority, social status, religious adherence, and public perception combined to shape every individual's role in society. Understanding his context is crucial to comprehending why certain practices, particularly those associated with marriage and the control of women, could emerge, sometimes to extremes that even contemporaries would find unsettling. The disturbing wedding night ritual that Rome tried to erase from history did not occur in a vacuum. It was a product of these broader social structures, a grim reflection of a civilization that valued family honor and social cohesion above personal autonomy. By examining the underlying mechanisms of Roman society, we gain insight into not only the ritual itself, but also the pervasive cultural forces that allowed such practices to exist in ancient Rome. Marriage was never merely a private matter between two individuals. It was an institution deeply entwined with politics, wealth, religion, and social order. Unlike modern Western notions of marriage, which emphasize romantic love and personal choice, Roman marriage functioned primarily as a civic duty, a mechanism for consolidating power, ensuring the continuity of family lines, and maintaining social cohesion. Understanding this civic dimension is essential to grasp why marriage could simultaneously be celebrated as a sacred union and manipulated as a tool of control. The primary purpose of Roman marriage was not emotional fulfillment, but the preservation and enhancement of family status. Roman families, especially those in the upper echelons of society, viewed marital unions as strategic alliances. By carefully selecting spouses, families could secure political alliances, access new economic opportunities, and strengthen social networks. Marriages were meticulously arranged, often negotiated through intermediaries or the family patriarch himself. In many cases, the bride and groom had little say in the decision. Their personal desires were secondary to the interests of their families. Marriage contracts known as sponsalia, were formal agreements that outlined the obligations of both families and set the terms for dowries, property transfers, and inheritance rights. Dowries were particularly significant, as they represented a tangible investment in the union and a safeguard for the bride in the event of widowhood or divorce. The dowry was not merely a gift, it was a legal and economic instrument that bound families together, ensuring that the bride brought tangible wealth and social advantage to her new household. These contracts were legally binding and closely monitored by Roman authorities, underscoring the civic and contractual nature of marriage. Ceremonies themselves reflected the dual role of marriage as both a personal and public affair. The wedding day was highly ritualized, combining domestic, religious, and social elements. The bride would be dressed in a tunica recta, a white gown symbolizing purity and obedience, and a flammeum, a bright orange veil representing her transition from her father's household to her husband's. Religious observances were central. Sacrifices were made to Juno, the goddess of marriage, and to household deities who would protect the couple's union. Prayers were recited to ensure fertility, prosperity, and the continuation of family lines. While these rituals were ostensibly celebratory, they also reinforced the bride's role as obedient and submissive, marking her as an instrument of family ambition and divine favor rather than an independent agent. The public dimension of marriage further emphasized its role as a civic duty. Roman weddings were occasions for families to display their social standing, wealth, and adherence to tradition. Feasts, processions, and public announcements ensured that the union was recognized not only within the immediate family, but also across the broader community. In elite circles, the grandeur of a wedding could enhance a family's reputation, demonstrate political alliances, and reinforce hierarchical structures. These public performances were carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances and to signal conformity to societal expectations. Any deviation or scandal could damage a family's dignity and influence, highlighting the high stakes involved in the seemingly personal act of marriage. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of these social expectations. The bride was expected to embody the virtues of pudicitia, modesty, and fides, loyalty, while navigating the complex web of familial and social obligations. Her value in the marriage was measured less by her personal qualities or desires, and more by her ability to uphold the family's honor, produce legitimate heirs, and adhere to ritual obligations. Fertility was paramount. A woman who could not bear children, particularly sons, could compromise the strategic objectives of the marriage and diminish her family's standing. In this sense, marriage was not merely a personal relationship. It was a performance in which women were judged, rewarded, or punished based on their ability to fulfill societal expectations. The legal framework of Roman marriage also reinforced its civic nature. Two primary forms existed, manus and sine manu. In a manus marriage, the bride passed under the legal authority of her husband, effectively transferring her allegiance from her father's household to her husband's. This legal shift gave the husband significant control over property, decision-making, and the lives of his wife and children. In a sine manu marriage, the bride remained under her father's authority, but was expected to live with her husband and fulfill marital duties. Regardless of the form, these arrangements highlighted that marriage was less about personal choice and more about the orderly transfer of social and economic obligations. Even divorce, though legally possible, carried social implications. While Roman law allowed spouses to dissolve marriages for various reasons, infidelity, infertility, or personal incompatibility, the social consequences could be severe. Divorce could disrupt family alliances, expose financial vulnerabilities, and tarnish reputations. Consequently, both men and women were encouraged to endure the obligations of marriage, sometimes at the expense of personal well-being. The enduring expectation was that individuals would subordinate their desires to the interests of family, society, and tradition. Religion intertwined deeply with marriage, further reinforcing its civic importance. Weddings were accompanied by rituals meant to invoke the protection of gods and ensure the fertility and prosperity of the union. Household gods, like the Lares and Peanuts, were believed to watch over domestic harmony, while public deities such as Juno, Venus, and Hymen oversaw broader aspects of love, fertility, and marital success. Religious participation was not optional. Neglecting ritual observance could be interpreted as impiety and could jeopardize both the family's social standing and divine favor. These rituals also reinforced hierarchy and obedience, serving as subtle instruments of control over the bride, who was tasked with maintaining proper religious conduct and ensuring the household's spiritual stability. Within this framework, it becomes evident why certain private wedding customs could evolve into disturbing practices. The extreme emphasis on family honor, religious duty, and social expectation created an environment where personal autonomy was often suppressed. Private rituals performed away from the public eye could enforce obedience, test loyalty, and assert control over the bride in ways that were physically and psychologically invasive. The boundaries between public duty and private subjugation were fluid, and the pressures to conform could justify practices that modern observers would consider deeply troubling. It is also essential to recognize the broader cultural context. Rome was a civilization obsessed with order, hierarchy, and legacy. Marriage was a mechanism for maintaining this order, ensuring that property, influence, and family lines were carefully managed. The civic aspect of marriage was inseparable from social ambition. Each wedding served as both a contractual obligation and a public statement. Within this system, rituals, whether public or private, were tools to enforce conformity, loyalty, and the continuity of Roman ideals. In conclusion, marriage in ancient Rome was far more than a personal or romantic choice. It was a civic duty, an institution embedded in law, religion, and societal expectation. Families used it strategically to consolidate power, secure wealth, and maintain social hierarchies. Ceremonies combined religious devotion, public display, and private control, often placing extraordinary pressure on women to embody family honor and ensure generational continuity. Understanding marriage as a civic duty reveals the context in which extreme private rituals could emerge. It highlights a society where personal autonomy was often sacrificed for family, faith, and social prestige, a society in which disturbing traditions could flourish under the guise of duty, obedience, and honor. In ancient Rome, the institution of marriage was inextricably linked to family, politics, and social hierarchy. But perhaps no aspect of this structure reveals the society's rigidity more starkly than the role of women. Unlike men, whose social, political, and legal identities were intertwined with public life, women were primarily defined by their relationships within the domestic sphere. A woman's value was largely determined by her ability to uphold family honor, bear legitimate heirs, and navigate the complex web of societal expectations. Understanding the limited agency of women in Roman matrimony is critical to comprehending the private rituals and disturbing practices that could occur behind the veil of socially sanctioned union. Roman society was fundamentally patriarchal. The legal framework reinforced male authority in every sphere of life, including marriage. Under the system of patria potestas, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household held virtually unlimited authority over his children and descendants, including daughters. While sons could eventually attain independence, daughters were often seen as instruments of alliance, their primary function being to secure familial advantage through marriage. A father's decision regarding his daughter's marriage was rarely questioned. Her consent was often assumed or considered irrelevant, particularly in elite families where alliances carried significant political or economic weight. This legal and social structure ensured that a woman's voice in matters of matrimony was secondary to the needs and ambitions of her family. Marriage itself could take one of two primary forms, manus and sine manu. In a manus marriage, the bride passed under the legal authority of her husband, effectively severing her legal ties with her birth family. She became, in effect, a permanent member of her husband's household, subject to his control. In a sine manu marriage, she remained legally under her father's authority while living with her husband, still bound by her father's expectations. Both arrangements restricted her autonomy. In the first, she was controlled by her husband. In the second, she remained accountable to her natal family. In either case, her personal desires, ambitions, or consent were secondary to the strategic needs of the families involved. Women's lack of agency extended to the very concept of sexual autonomy. The social and legal structures of Rome treated women's bodies as extensions of family property and honor. Marital obedience was not optional. Wives were expected to conform to the demands of their husbands and in-laws. Fertility was paramount, particularly in elite households, where the continuation of lineage was a civic as well as familial concern. A woman who could not bear children, especially male heirs, was often stigmatized, and her inability to fulfill this duty could lead to social and familial consequences. In this context, marriage became less a partnership and more a mechanism for ensuring the perpetuation of family lines, with women as the vessels through which social and political ambitions were realized. Despite these constraints, Roman women were not entirely powerless. They could exercise subtle influence within their households and, in some cases, wield significant social authority. Elite women, particularly those of high status, could manage estates, oversee finances, and engage in religious rituals that reinforced their family's prestige. However, these forms of influence were carefully circumscribed. They operated within the boundaries of patriarchal oversight. Women's authority was indirect, often behind the scenes, and rarely challenged the structural limitations imposed by law and custom. This duality, a combination of restriction and subtle empowerment, created a social dynamic where women could navigate their circumstances, yet always within a framework designed to prioritize family and societal obligations over personal autonomy. Consent, as understood in modern terms, was largely absent in Roman marriage. While legal formalities sometimes included verbal agreements, the notion of freely given personal choice was rarely a priority. In elite marriages, the bride's consent was often symbolic, with families negotiating contracts and dowries long before she had any say in the matter. Even when a bride expressed reluctance, social norms and familial pressure typically ensured compliance. Resistance could have severe consequences. It could dishonor the family, reduce her prospects, or provoke punitive measures designed to enforce obedience. Thus, consent existed more as a ceremonial acknowledgement than a meaningful exercise of personal agency. The societal emphasis on female obedience extended to ceremonial and ritualistic practices surrounding marriage. Wedding rituals were designed to assert control, demonstrate familial and religious propriety, and ensure the bride's transition into her new household. From the intricate preparation of clothing and veils to the performance of sacrifices and prayers, every detail symbolically reinforced the bride's submission to authority. Even seemingly benign gestures, such as the ritual removal of the bride from her father's home, carried heavy implications, marking her passage from one sphere of control to another. The rituals themselves were not merely symbolic. They often reinforced physical and psychological expectations of obedience, subtly conditioning the bride to accept her socially prescribed role. Religion played a central role in regulating female behavior within marriage. Wives were responsible for maintaining domestic religious practices, ensuring the favor of household gods, and participating in broader public rituals that reinforced family and societal stability. Failure to adhere to these religious duties could invite social censure or be interpreted as a moral failing. Religious observance, therefore, became another means through which women's actions were monitored and controlled. Their role in these ceremonies, while outwardly respected, also served to reinforce the hierarchy of male authority and the limited scope of female autonomy. The combination of legal restriction, social expectation, and religious obligation created a framework in which disturbing practices could emerge. Private rituals, particularly those conducted behind closed doors, were often justified as necessary for maintaining family honor, ensuring fertility or appeasing the gods. These practices could be physically or psychologically invasive, targeting the bride's obedience, fidelity, or sexual conduct. While public celebrations portrayed weddings as joyful and sacred, the private realities of compliance and control were far more complex and at times profoundly troubling. The absence of meaningful consent, coupled with societal and religious pressures, made these private rituals possible and largely unchallenged. It is also important to consider the intersection of class and gender. Elite women, while enjoying certain privileges and social influence, were subject to immense pressure to uphold family reputation. Lower-class women faced different challenges. They were often married for economic survival, had less ceremonial preparation, and experienced more overt forms of labor and exploitation. In both cases, the underlying principle remained the same. Women's lives and bodies were largely subordinated to societal expectations, leaving little room for autonomy or personal desire. In conclusion, the role of women in Roman matrimony illuminates the broader dynamics of power, control, and social obligation that defined ancient society. Women were central to the continuity of family and society, yet their autonomy was severely constrained by legal, social, and religious structures. Consent, as understood today, was largely absent. Compliance was expected, enforced, and ritualized. These constraints set the stage for private practices that could be disturbed by modern standards, particularly when obedience, fertility, and family honor intersected with ritualistic tradition. By understanding the limited agency of Roman women, we gain crucial insight into how and why certain wedding customs, though hidden from public view, could take on extreme forms, reflecting the broader societal imperatives that governed every aspect of life in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, superstition and religious observance were not merely peripheral aspects of daily life. They were central to the way Romans interpreted the world, navigated uncertainty, and legitimized societal norms. From the moment of birth to death, every major life event was steeped in ritualistic practice and divine oversight. This pervasive belief system profoundly influenced marriage, a cornerstone of Roman civic and familial life, and created the conditions in which extreme and, at times, disturbing private rituals could emerge. Understanding the interplay between superstition, omens, and religious practices is therefore essential to contextualize the wedding night traditions that Rome sought to erase from history. Roman religion was both polytheistic and highly pragmatic. The Romans worshipped a vast pantheon of deities, each responsible for specific domains of life, from agriculture and warfare to family and household stability. Among these deities, certain gods and goddesses held special significance in the context of marriage. Juno, for instance, was the goddess of marriage and childbirth, and her favor was considered essential to a union's success. Venus, the goddess of love and desire, and Hymen, the god of weddings, were also called upon to bless unions, ensure fertility, and protect the bride and groom. Rituals aimed at these deities were not optional niceties. They were perceived as critical interventions that could determine the outcome of a marriage, the prosperity of a family, and the continuity of lineage. Superstition was intricately woven into every aspect of Roman wedding ceremonies. Romans believed that the gods communicated their approval or disapproval through omens, signs, and portents. A seemingly minor incident, such as the way a flame flickered during a sacrifice or the flight pattern of birds, could be interpreted as a divine message. Families often consulted augurs, specialized priests trained in interpreting these signs to ensure that their marriages were auspicious. A bride's journey to her husband's house, for example, might be delayed or altered if an ill omen was perceived, reflecting a profound anxiety over divine judgment. These beliefs extended beyond mere caution. They provided a framework in which ritualized control over the bride could be rationalized as divinely sanctioned necessity. The wedding itself was a carefully orchestrated combination of public spectacle and private ritual, designed to satisfy both social and divine expectations. Public ceremonies involved feasts, processions, and sacrifices, which demonstrated the family's social standing and piety. Private ceremonies conducted behind closed doors were often far more detailed and intricate. These included rituals intended to ensure fertility, test loyalty, and protect the bride from malevolent forces. While public ceremonies emphasized celebration and spectacle, private rituals carried a more serious undertone, reflecting the pervasive anxiety that the gods' favor could be withdrawn if the bride or groom failed to observe proper ritual behavior. Among these practices, the role of the bride was especially scrutinized. Women were believed to have a dual responsibility. They had to honor both their husband and the household gods. Domestic religious duties were considered essential for the prosperity of the household. Wives were tasked with maintaining household shrines, offering daily prayers and sacrifices to the lares and peanuts, the protective household spirits, and ensuring that the home remained a locus of spiritual order. Their success in these tasks was believed to directly influence the well-being of the family, the fertility of the household, and even the political fortunes of their relatives. Failure to perform these duties could invite social censure, spiritual misfortune, or familial disapproval. Divination and omen reading extended beyond the formal rituals of the wedding day. Roman families often sought guidance from horrifying, priests who interpreted the entrails of sacrificed animals, or augurs who read the patterns of the sky and birds. A bride or groom whose arrival was accompanied by a bad omen might be subject to additional rituals designed to avert misfortune. Such practices, though cloaked in religiosity, sometimes imposed physical or psychological tests upon the bride. The rationale was clear: divine will was paramount, and human desire or comfort was secondary. These interventions could range from protective charms and recitations to more invasive and controlling actions intended to guarantee obedience, fertility, and household stability. Fertility was a particular focus of superstition in the context of marriage. The production of legitimate heirs was essential for maintaining family lines and consolidating political and economic power. Romans believed that fertility was not merely biological but divinely mediated. A bride who bore children, especially sons, demonstrated both her obedience and the favor of the gods. Conversely, infertility could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, a moral failing, or a potential threat to family prestige. This belief created a heightened pressure on women to perform their roles flawlessly, often reinforcing the need for rituals, some of which could be extreme or disturbing, to ensure fertility and divine approval. Superstition also extended to the timing and sequencing of rituals. Romans were acutely aware of auspicious dates, celestial alignments, and symbolic gestures. Wedding ceremonies were often scheduled to coincide with favorable astrological periods, while sacrifices and prayers followed specific patterns believed to maximize divine favor. Even seemingly minor errors, wearing the wrong color, placing offerings incorrectly, or neglecting a single step in the ritual, could be seen as dangerous oversights with far-reaching consequences. This obsessive attention to ritual detail created an environment in which private, controlling, and even invasive practices could be justified as necessary to secure divine protection. The fear of malevolent forces also shaped wedding customs. Romans believed that spirits, curses, and other supernatural entities could interfere with marriages, causing infertility, discord, or misfortune. Protective rituals aimed at warding off these threats often involved the bride in highly controlled and symbolic acts, reinforcing her subordination and emphasizing the family's responsibility to shield her from harm. The overlap between superstition and patriarchal authority created a unique dynamic. Rituals that might seem cruel or invasive to modern sensibilities were legitimized as both religious duty and civic responsibility. In essence, the combination of superstition, religious observance, and social expectation created a society in which extreme practices could flourish under the guise of necessity. The public face of marriage, A joyful celebration with sacrifices, feasts and processions masked the private pressures placed upon the bride. She was expected to obey, to honor the gods, and to ensure the prosperity of her new household, often at the expense of person. Autonomy, or comfort. The deeply held belief that divine favor could be influenced or withdrawn through ritualized behavior allowed families to justify practices that modern observers would find disturbing. Ultimately, superstition and religious practice were not merely cultural quirks, they were tools of social control. They reinforced patriarchal authority, emphasized obedience, and created conditions in which private rituals could be carried out with minimal challenge. The pervasive fear of divine displeasure, coupled with the intense societal focus on family honor, fertility, and lineage, ensured that women, in particular, were subject to an intricate web of expectation and control. These pressures laid the groundwork for the more extreme wedding night rituals that Rome later tried to suppress, demonstrating how religion and superstition could intersect with law, social hierarchy, and private life to create profoundly disturbing practices. In ancient Rome, the distinction between public and private life was not always clear, and nowhere was this more evident than in the customs surrounding marriage. Weddings were simultaneously civic events, religious ceremonies, and private domestic affairs. The public aspect was carefully orchestrated to display wealth, status, and piety, while private rituals were often charged with intimate and at times coercive expectations. This interplay between the public spectacle and private obligation created a complex social environment, particularly for women whose obedience, fertility, and morality were closely scrutinized. Understanding this thin line between public and private ceremonies is essential to appreciating why certain wedding practices could become extreme, secretive, and, by modern standards, disturbing. Public ceremonies were grand, carefully choreographed affairs that emphasized the social and civic dimensions of marriage. Families showcased their wealth, status, and political connections through elaborate feasts, processions, and public rituals. The bride, dressed in ceremonial garments such as the tunica recta and the flammeum, was paraded before the community, embodying the honor and virtue of her household. The groom, likewise, symbolized the merging of power and lineage between two families. These public displays were far more than aesthetic. They reinforced societal hierarchy, confirmed political alliances, and signaled compliance with civic expectations. Success in these public ceremonies elevated a family's prestige, while mistakes, omissions, or scandals could tarnish reputations for generations. Religious observance was integral to these public events. Sacrifices, prayers, and symbolic gestures were performed not only to honor the gods but also to invoke their protection over the union. Gods such as Juno, Hymen, and the household deities Lares and Peanuts were invoked to ensure fertility, prosperity, and harmony. Public piety demonstrated a family's commitment to tradition and the divine order, reinforcing the idea that marriage was as much a duty to the gods as to one's family or social class. Omitting even minor ritual steps could invite divine displeasure, further highlighting the importance of public adherence to ceremonial norms. Yet beneath the grandeur of public ceremonies lay a private dimension that was often more complex and at times unsettling. Private wedding rituals, conducted behind closed doors, were designed to ensure the bride's obedience, the fertility of the union, and the continuity of the family line. These rituals were closely guarded secrets, often known only to the family and select religious officials. The bride's transition from her father's household to her husband's home was marked by a series of symbolic acts, each reinforcing her subordination and her role in perpetuating family honor. While these acts were framed in terms of protection, piety, and tradition, they frequently imposed psychological or physical pressures on the bride, conditioning her to accept the authority of her husband and family unquestioningly. The private ceremonies also reflected the Romans' preoccupation with omens and divine favor. Augurs, haruspices, and other religious specialists were sometimes consulted to guide the rituals, ensuring that the marriage was auspicious. The bride might be asked to perform specific acts or recite prayers to appease household gods or protect against malevolent spirits. Fertility, obedience, and sexual propriety were often central to these rites. While public celebrations showcased social standing, private rituals tested compliance and reinforced hierarchies within the household. The line between public observance and private control was, therefore, thin and often deliberately blurred, allowing families to justify practices that would have been unacceptable in the open. The bride herself was at the center of this delicate balance between public expectation and private obligation. She was expected to perform flawlessly in public, embodying virtue, modesty, and grace, while simultaneously navigating the intricate demands of private rituals that often imposed psychological stress. Her obedience was interpreted as a reflection of family honor and divine favor, and any deviation could be construed as a moral failing with serious consequences. Private rituals could include tests of loyalty, symbolic acts of submission, or protective rites designed to ensure fertility and prevent misfortune. In some cases, these acts were physically invasive or psychologically coercive, reflecting the extreme lengths to which families would go to secure conformity and success. The thin line between public and private ceremonies also had profound social implications. Roman society valued appearances above all else, and the successful execution of public rituals could mask the pressures and constraints experienced behind closed doors. The community judged families based on the spectacle of the wedding, while the private practices that reinforced obedience and ensured the union's prosperity remained hidden. This duality highlights the social engineering inherent in Roman marriage. Public rituals maintained social cohesion, while private rituals enforced familial and patriarchal control. Both were essential to the functioning of the society, yet they created a space where extreme practices could occur away from public scrutiny. Furthermore, these private rituals were deeply intertwined with the legal and civic structures of Rome. Marriage was not merely a personal union, but a contractual and legal agreement between families. The bride's compliance with private rituals ensured that she fulfilled her role in this contract, producing legitimate heirs and safeguarding property and social alliances. Failure to comply could have legal, financial, and social repercussions. In this sense, private rituals were as much about enforcing civic duty and legal obligation as they were about religious or familial concerns. The interplay of public and private ceremonies also sheds light on why certain wedding night rituals, though hidden from historical records, were likely to occur. In a society where public appearances were meticulously maintained, families could conceal practices that reinforced control, obedience, and fertility behind closed doors. The societal pressure to succeed publicly, combined with the religious imperative to secure divine favor, created an environment in which extreme rituals were not only possible but often considered necessary. Private ceremonies operated in a zone where social, legal, and religious expectations converged, making them resistant to scrutiny and criticism. Ultimately, the thin line between public and private ceremonies in Roman weddings reflects the complexity and rigidity of Roman social structures. Public rituals reinforced social hierarchy, civic duty, and religious piety, while private rituals enforced obedience, fertility, and family honor. Women, as the central figures in marriage, bore the brunt of this duality, expected to excel in public while submitting to private pressures. The coexistence of public celebration and private coercion created a context in which disturbing practices could emerge and persist, hidden from the public eye yet justified by tradition, religion, and civic responsibility. In conclusion, the interplay of public and private ceremonies in Roman marriage reveals a society obsessed with order, appearance, and control. Weddings were not simply celebrations, but carefully managed events that balanced civic duty, religious observance, and familial expectations. Public ceremonies emphasized social standing, piety, and alliance, while private rituals reinforced obedience, fertility, and moral propriety. This delicate, often invisible balance allowed families to enforce extreme practices behind closed doors while presenting a facade of joy, virtue, and piety to the wider community. It is within this private sphere, shaped by religion, superstition, and patriarchal authority, that the disturbing wedding night ritual Rome sought to erase could take place, reflecting the darker realities that underpinned even the most celebrated ceremonies of ancient life.